1 month after Greeley published his prayer of 20 millions, Lincoln issued on September 22, 1862, a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation announcing his intention to free the slaves 100 days later. The preliminary proclamation provoked a rush of commentary, including a remarkable essay in the Atlantic Monthly magazine written by none other than Ralph Waldo Emerson, the famed transcendentalist. Emerson's essay can be read as a response to Horace Greeley's prayer of 20 millions, an alternative explanation for the timing of the president's proclamation, except that Emerson's explanation for the delay reflected glory rather than disgrace upon Lincoln. Where Greeley gave us the myth of the reluctant emancipator, Emerson gave us the myth of the great emancipator. "Liberty is a slow fruit," Emerson began. He was laying the foundation for an explanation of why it took Lincoln so long to issue his proclamation. It takes time for the fruit of liberty to ripen. The public was not yet ready, Emerson explained. The audience for the proclamation had to be created. An audience, quote, "hitherto passive and unconcerned, now at last so scorched and kindled that they come forward." When the war began, Emerson suggested, public indifference to slavery was so ingrained, hostility to emancipation so deep, that Lincoln had to wait to educate the people up to the justice of the cause before he could act. And so Lincoln waited with infinite patience until the public sentiment of the country was at last unmistakably pronounced. When we consider the immense opposition to emancipation that Lincoln faced, Emerson declared, quote, "one can hardly say the deliberation took too long. Indeed, against all timorous counsels, Lincoln had the courage to seize the moment. This was greatness, and since it's Emerson talking, we might as well call it transcendental greatness." Lincoln was so fair-minded, so patient, and yet so modest, that we can only marvel at the capacity and virtue which, quote, "divine providence has made an instrument of benefit so vast." As God's chosen instrument, Lincoln really had no choice but to issue his proclamation. He was put here at this time and in this place to do what had to be done. It was his destiny. Lincoln, Emerson wrote, quote, "has been permitted to do more for America than any other American man." And just what is it that Lincoln did? He removed the blot of slavery from our national honor, lifted the heavy load of the national heart. He freed the slaves, but he also redeemed the nation. So, we have two competing explanations for the delayed timing of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, and as I've indicated, both of them were more or less fully developed before the proclamation was issued on January 1st, 1863. Greeley's Lincoln was the reluctant emancipator, Emerson's was the great emancipator. Greeley claimed to speak for 20 million Northerners who were waiting anxiously for Lincoln to finally issue the proclamation. Emerson's Lincoln was faced with immense popular opposition to emancipation. He waited patiently for public opinion to come around to his more advanced views. They can't both be right, but they can both be wrong. Both Greeley and Emerson were blinded by the false premise of the question they were asking: what took Lincoln so long? That question assumes that emancipation would not begin until Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. But the fact is that the Lincoln administration had begun formally emancipating slaves more than a year earlier, on August 8, 1861. There was no 20-month delay requiring any explanation. Lincoln was neither reluctant to emancipate slaves, nor was he waiting patiently for public opinion to catch up with him. By the time he issued the proclamation, the Union had been freeing slaves for almost a year and a half. Tens of thousands of slaves. So the mythology of the proclamation is doubly misleading. It's not merely that the Greeley and Emerson explanations for Lincoln's timing were wrong, it's that they both assumed that there had been no emancipation until Lincoln finally at long last proclaimed it. The myth erased the history. All the emancipations prior to January 1st, 1863 have simply disappeared from our historical memory. And until we recover that history, until we understand how and why slaves were emancipated before the Emancipation Proclamation, we can't possibly understand what the proclamation actually did, or, to be more precise, what the proclamation changed. In the mythic account, emancipation begins with Lincoln's long-awaited proclamation. In the historical account, it begins much earlier, in the spring of 1861, 6 weeks after the war began. On May 30th, Lincoln met with his cabinet to discuss a request by General Benjamin Butler at Fortress Monroe in Virginia that he be allowed to withhold runaway slaves from their owners. 3 slaves had escaped to his lines asking for asylum, and when the owners showed up demanding that their fugitives be returned, Butler refused. He called the slaves contraband of war. He sent 2 urgent letters to Washington, one on May 27th, the second on May 28th, asking whether he had done the right thing. The cabinet met to discuss Butler's request 2 days later, on May 30th, and when the meeting was over, the War Department telegraphed the general at Fortress Monroe not only approving the contraband policy, but authorizing Butler to refuse to return any runaway slaves who came within his lines. There's the first move. Barely 6 weeks after Fort Sumter, the Lincoln administration stopped enforcing the fugitive slave clause of the Constitution for slaves coming within Union lines from any seceded state. But it wasn't emancipation. Butler was authorized to retain the fugitives, but he wasn't authorized to free them. Only Congress could determine the status of the fugitives, and that's what Congress proceeded very quickly to do. Shortly after the attack on Fort Sumter, President Lincoln called on Congress to come back into Washington for an emergency session 5 months ahead of schedule, beginning on July 4th, 1861. Less than 3 weeks later, on July 20th, Senator Lyman Trumbull reported a confiscation bill to the floor and immediately attached an amendment that would emancipate any slaves used by Confederates in support of the rebellion. Trumbull's Emancipation Amendment became Section 4 of the First Confiscation Act, endorsed by nearly every Republican in Congress, and signed into law by the President on August 6, 1861. Under the terms of the First Confiscation Act, emancipation would be a 2-step process. First, Congress decreed that the masters would quote, forfeit the services of any slaves used in rebellion. Then the President would emancipate the forfeited slaves by virtue of his authority as Commander-in-Chief, thus giving emancipation the requisite military character the Constitution required. And so on August 8, 1861, 2 days after he signed the bill into law, Lincoln's War Department issued the instructions for implementing it. Rebel masters would forfeit the service of any slaves used in support of the rebellion, and those slaves were, quote, discharged from service permanently, which is to say they were emancipated. But there was more. The House of Representatives had also endorsed a resolution declaring that Union soldiers were not supposed to participate in the capture or return of fugitive slaves. And that meant that any slave coming into Union lines in the seceded states could not be returned to their owners. What was the War Department supposed to do with a law that said you freed the slaves of all rebels, and another congressional resolution that said don't return any slaves who come within your lines? The answer was free all the slaves who come within your lines. The August 8th, that's the August 8th instructions that they sent out. They were sent that day, on August 8th, to Fortress Monroe, where there were by then 900 contrabands, all of whom were immediately freed. That was only the beginning. In September, a copy of the August 8th instructions were sent to General John Dix in Maryland, ordering him to emancipate any slaves escaping into his lines from the seceded state of Virginia. In November, the August 8th instructions were given to the commander of the Joint Army-Navy operation that established a Union beachhead at Port Royal on the Sea Islands of South Carolina. and the 9,000 slaves on those islands were immediately emancipated. In December, the Adjutant General of the War Department ordered General Henry Halleck to emancipate any slaves fleeing into the loyal state of Kentucky from the seceded state of Tennessee. And in his first annual message to Congress that same month, December of 1861, President Lincoln noted that under the terms of the First Confiscation Act, numerous slaves had escaped into Union lines and were, quote, thus liberated, end quote. Emancipation accelerated over the course of 1862. In February, General Ambrose Burnside captured New Bern, North Carolina, whereupon he freed the slaves. In April, when General David Hunter captured Fort Pulaski and Cockspur Island and several of the other surrounding islands off the coast of Georgia, he freed the slaves, for he too had been given a copy of the August 8th War Department instructions. And in June, when General George McClellan led his immense Army of the Potomac up the peninsula headed toward Richmond, he followed the same orders. All slaves who came within his lines were emancipated. Loyal masters might someday be compensated, McClellan explained, but their slaves were immediately and permanently freed. By the spring of 1862, thousands of slaves all along the southern Atlantic coast, from Hampton Roads in Virginia to Fernandina in Florida, had been emancipated under the War Department's August 8th instructions implementing the First Confiscation Act. Emancipation, in other words, began on August 8, 1861, not January 1st, 1863. Once we understand what the First Confiscation Act actually did, the reluctant emancipator thesis begins to collapse. Take Lincoln's famous revocation of General Fremont's order emancipating all the slaves of all rebels in Missouri. Lincoln never actually told the general that he couldn't free slaves. He told Fremont to rewrite his order to conform to the First Confiscation Act, which freed slaves. Fremont's original order was technically illegal. Rather than emancipate the slaves in areas over which Fremont had no control, Lincoln ordered the general to emancipate rebel-owned slaves coming within Union lines, as the law required. Lincoln subsequently revoked General David Hunter's order for the same reason. Actually, Hunter had issued two orders. The first one freed all the slaves who came within his lines around Fort Pulaski and Cockspur Island. That order was legal, and nobody reversed it. Then Hunter issued a second order abolishing slavery in 3 entire states, Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida. That order was illegal, and Lincoln revoked it. In short, Lincoln never told either Hunter or Fremont that they could not emancipate slaves, only that if they were going to do it, they had to do it within the law. On April 24, 1862, the Union Navy, commanded by David Farragut, broke through the Confederate defenses of the lower Mississippi River, capturing New Orleans and with it the heavily populated plantation parishes of southern Louisiana. Transferred from Virginia, our old friend Benjamin Butler took control of the area, but he wasn't sure if the tens of thousands of slaves in southern Louisiana met the criteria for emancipation established by the First Confiscation Act or the War Department's August 8th instructions. Unlike the Sea Islands and Fortress Monroe, the Louisiana slaveholders did not all flee from the Union Army, and many claimed to have been loyal. Because the slaves of such owners remained on their plantations, it was unclear whether they came within Union lines as the law required. Were those slaves emancipated, Butler asked his superiors in Washington. Congress answered his question with a second Confiscation Act, which Lincoln signed into law on June 17, 1862. That law declared that in Union-occupied areas of the South, areas that had been formerly occupied by the Confederates, that is, areas like southern Louisiana, slaves owned by anyone who could not demonstrate continuous loyalty to the Union were immediately emancipated. Right away, Lincoln sent word to Butler to implement the new rules. By the act of Congress, Butler began telling his subordinates, quote, "They are clearly free."